The term net neutrality is new, but the idea behind it has existed since the invention of the telegram and has also been applied to other telecommunication technologies like telephones. Telegrams and telephones have been considered what is called common carriers under US law. This simply means that the companies that own your telephone line have been forbidden to give any preferential treatment to clients or their partners. Without this law, this could mean that if AT&T partners up with Apple, they might give a discounted rate to people who buy an iPhone while they jack up the rate to anyone who buys, let's say, an Android. In short, this law protects us from being manipulated by these giant companies and makes sure that they treat us fairly and justly. This law is also known as Title II of the Communications Act. Basically, phone companies have been regulated by a governmental organization known as the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC for short, since 1934. The purpose of the FCC is to make sure phone companies offer fair pricing and access. But what does this have to do with the internet? Net neutrality is basically the idea that the internet should have the same law applied to it. And in 2015, the FCC gave us that protection when it placed the internet under the common carrier law. This means that internet service providers like Comcast and AT&T must treat everything on the internet the same. For example, if Comcast and Google are in partnership, Comcast will not be allowed to block their users from competing search engines like Yahoo or Bing. Or if a Comcast customer uses an application on their computer like BitTorrent, which allows you to download files directly off another person's computer, which ends up mostly being porn, music, and Game of Thrones, Comcast can't block that application from internet access. And you might say that's even crazy to think about. Your internet provider is blocking you from certain websites or applications. I mean, we aren't in elementary school anymore, and it isn't the job of our internet service providers to regulate what we do on the internet. The job we pay them to do is simply provide us with open internet access. But that doesn't stop them from doing it anyways. In fact, a few years ago, Comcast was secretly blocking BitTorrent on people's computers from accessing the internet and didn't stop until the FCC intervened. Another internet giant, AT&T, was restricting their customers' access to FaceTime. Why? To get their customers to purchase bigger data plans. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. So you're probably asking, why the hell would anyone want to end net neutrality in the first place? This is something that provides us access to the open internet, and by taking it away, it would mean putting more power into the hands of the internet giants like Comcast and AT&T, who could then regulate what we do on the web and which services we use. Well, it turns out that there are a lot of arguments on this side of the table. One even compares net neutrality to vanilla ice cream. Jeffrey Dorfman, some econ professor somewhere, says that net neutrality is like if a store only has vanilla ice cream for sale. He says it limits people's choices because many want and would pay for another flavor. However, this is exactly what net neutrality is trying to prevent, giving power to internet service providers to offer us only vanilla ice cream. We want chocolate, caramel, and even green tea from time to time, and we don't want to have to pay for multiple internet service providers to get such a variety. We want freedom of choice and a plethora of different flavors that come from one source. Sure, more internet service providers means more competition, which might mean lower fees to purchase internet access, and that's not a bad thing. But what most are scared of is that our internet service providers choosing what types of applications or websites we can connect to. And again, we don't just want to connect to a vanilla flavored website. Okay, but that can't be the only reason to end net neutrality, right? The most recent advocate to end net neutrality is the currently newly appointed FCC chairman by way of Donald Trump, Ajit Vardarajan. Yeah, you heard correctly. The guy who is supposed to regulate our internet service providers is also the guy who wants to end the regulation of our internet service providers. So what are his reasons? He says that when the FCC passed that law we talked about earlier in 2015, the one that ensures internet service providers are regulated under the same law that telephone companies are, we de-incentivize companies from expanding internet access to many parts of the country. But the fact is that 87% of the American population uses the internet, and of the 13% that don't, the majority are just too old to care. Another thing he says is that since 2015, net neutrality laws have been stifling investment and that the top 12 internet service providers have lost around 5.6% in investments. And while this may be true, if you just look at Comcast stock over the last 2 years, it is up 35%. Not bad, huh? I'm not an economist or the head of the FCC, but it looks like things are going all right for at least this internet giant. So why should you or me or anyone care about this? Well, on May 18th of 2017, the FCC voted to let Mr. Pai move forward with the changes he wants to make to net neutrality, which would do 3 major things. But first, a word from the president and CEO of the Internet Association, Michael Beckerman.
But this is a critically important issue for the internet, and frankly, because we've had these rules and at least the overhang of the rules since 2005, I do believe that this is why you've had this great innovation that you've seen online, because the barrier of entry is so very, very low. You know, imagine if back in 2005 or even 2010, if ISPs were able to play gatekeeper or charge entry, you wouldn't have all these new companies that are coming up and creating jobs and growing our economy. And so that's why we're fighting to keep these rules.
So what changes does Pai want to make to something that clearly already works for the consumer? Simple. In a nutshell, he wants to make it more corporate friendly and less consumer and small business friendly. First, this new policy removes net neutrality from its Title II protection that the internet and telephones are both currently protected by and places it under something called Title I Information Services. What does this mean? It means that the FCC would no longer be obligated to protect the consumer and online businesses against unjust and unreasonable practices of internet service providers. So basically, Comcast and AT&T would have the go-ahead to charge unreasonable prices, not that they already don't, to the consumer and small businesses. Second, it would block any future net neutrality rules that haven't already been thought of. So if we noticed a regulation that isn't working in the policy, it doesn't matter. We won't be able to improve on it or come up with a new policy that's better. And third, the question about whether internet service providers can block or slow down access to certain applications or websites, which both Comcast and AT&T have done in the past, will be reopened. So again, why should you care? Well, you probably use the internet. I mean, you are watching this video. But to be honest, in the end, the only thing that really matters is thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. It really helps.